I'd love to switch gears and talk a little bit about like the personal development of a salesperson over time. Because I think there's like a huge difference between closing a deal, right, as an AE and then managing a sales team as a sales manager versus being a director of sales versus being a VP and then eventually a CRO. And I'd love to like think about these different stages. Like, what do you see as sort of the major differences? And I think maybe it's more obvious between AE and manager, but then maybe it gets a little blurry as you sort of move up in sales leadership. So yeah, how do you think about it changing over time?
Totally. I think the AE and the manager one is probably one of the bigger jumps. And I almost think about it as parallel tracks. I think a lot of companies set it up where, like, oh, you're an AE, you crush your quota, next step is become a manager. And I think that's just wrong. Consistency in getting to quota and following process and being a good team player does, but getting to 200%, doesn't really tell me anything. And so I've always had manager and sort of the senior AE at different tracks. And so I think it is different. And we had a team lead program, if you remember, where folks could test it. And we had folks like Seth, who was, an early sales rep, and he was a team lead. And he was like, I love it, because it was meant to give reps exposure into management tasks and see if they actually like it. And so he did it for a quarter and he's like, I love it. This is what I want to do. And we promoted him into a manager. And we had Haley Wolf, who was also an AE and said, I want to be a manager. And she became a team lead. She did it for a couple quarters. And she's like, oh, I don't know. I like selling. I want to keep selling because I have my autonomy. And so it was a great sort of way for people to sort of test the waters of what management meant. And sort of the biggest difference in going, in each of those levels is like your level of control continues to reduce, but your level of accountability continues to increase. So it's a really weird thing to manage your own psyche against. Like when I was a rep, I had full control of my book of business. How am I going to get to my number? What do I do? Like I can control every piece of it. Became a manager. Then I have to, I've sort of focused on my team and hope that they get to their number so I get to mine. And the higher up you go, it just, you've got more and more accountability. Ultimately, I'm on the hook if we don't make our revenue number in front of the board, but I can't really make deals happen. And sort of, the reality is the team is doing all the work. And I'm just here facilitating and making sure that they have the right resources and the right sort of setup to be successful. So I think that is the hardest part for people to jump from every level. And at the C level, it's like you're a company leader.
So let's say I'm a VP of sales right now and I want to be a CRO. Like, what advice would you give to me? Like, how do I prove that I am CRO worthy? Is it thinking through like other functions like customer success and marketing and trying to understand those? Is it just getting better at sales? Like, yeah, what advice do you give to a VP of sales who wants to be a CRO?
Yeah, I think that is the part where it starts to get blurry. But my advice would be focusing on the company as a general company leader versus as a sales leader. Like you're always going to be the sales leader, like that's in your DNA. If you've grown up in sales, you'll always sort of think about how do you grow revenue? How do you focus on getting to highest attainment? But how do you really understand all the different pieces that have to go right for sales to do well? And so, yeah, it's becoming a general company leader where you could theoretically go run any department because you've got the sort of, you understand the different mechanics of how departments work, you're strategic. And so I think that is the key piece where you have, and, I think as the team grew, I spent less and less time with sales as a CRO and more time with other departments. Like my first team was the exec team and making sure that, the customer journey is uniform. Like you are, as a revenue leader of the company, you're the single point of accountability for all things growth and revenue, regardless of your purview, regardless of, what you formally own. It's ultimately you're accountable. And if that is too much, then a VP of sales, like you're responsible for your team's number, your region's number, and making sure that that is executed well. But as a revenue operator, you're thinking 2 years ahead and saying, how do I make sure that we're setting ourselves up to continue growing, not just this year's plan, but also next year? Like, what are the bets I'm seeding? So I think you're sort of the focus, as a VP of sales, I'm probably thinking 1 or 2 quarters ahead. As a CRO, you have to think 1 or 2 years ahead. That is the biggest difference, I'd say.
And let's talk about that exec team and kind of managing up, because so much of your job is working with the CEO and the board and the CFO and building a plan, and then you have to communicate your progress along the way, and then you have to show the forecast and all that. Can you just like give us a window into what that experience was like?
Oh gosh, so fun. That became bigger and bigger part of my job over time. And I think there's a lot of art and science to it. And, it's one of those things where you have to have all these different pieces come together. Where it's very grateful to have a great finance team that was helping us sort of put the pieces together. And on the flip side, we had ops and us sort of coming in and saying, here's, the top down plan, the bottoms up plan, and what feels realistic. I still remember my first board meeting, where I think it was just like 4 or 5 of us. And I came from, my past companies, board meetings were a big deal. We were Kleiner Sequoia backed. And so we were, very buttoned up. And I was like, I remember my first Lattice board meeting. It was awesome. We were just eating croissants and talking about the business. And then of course, over time it evolved. But and I think going through a pandemic and moving all the sort of things that have happened in the last 3 years, our planning cycles almost became from going from annual cycles to it felt like we were doing it quarterly because things were changing so rapidly. But so much of planning is sort of seeing both sides, negotiating and saying, hey, what feels realistic? I get that the spreadsheet says this. Here's the reality on the ground on what it takes to execute that spreadsheet to, getting the team to buy in and do this in a reasonable time frame without hurting culture. Because the other piece is like you can grow too fast and short term it may work. And long term, you've overhired capacity, you don't have enough leads, it causes all kinds of problems. And so my job again was to sort of bridge that gap between the board expectations, the finance point of view, and of course our point of view from the go to market is like, hey, here's what we can actually get done. And then communicating that to every person so people sort of internalize and understand why we're doing this and why it matters.
And I feel like every board member always wants to increase the numbers and move faster and hire more sales reps. And you look at the spreadsheet and you're like, wait, you have 5 sales reps? Why don't you go to 10 and you'll hit your number faster? And like, I'm curious how you emotionally process that as a sales leader, because that's stressful, like, right? And Lattice was pretty successful like the whole time we were there, but like it was always more and more and more. So yeah, how do you like emotionally handle that? Is it just like take a deep breath and deal with it, or what's
A
your
lot of
take?
wine.
Yeah, a lot of wine. Good. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's like, I think that's there's, sometimes it can feel like, well, if we don't do well, there's clearly a lot of heat you take. It's the highest accountability role. Like ultimately you're on the hook to deliver revenue. There's no excuses, the buck stops at you. But on the flip side, when you do well, it's like, well, are we too, why is our attainment 100%? It should be 80%. And we early on, we really wanted to keep our attainment high for cultural reasons to build that foundation of winning, which, is hard because the traditional way of thinking is do 80% attainment and make sure that you have more people capacity. And even if 20% of them aren't hitting quota. And so, yeah, it was, how do I cope? Mostly wine.